We have been hearing from the government about a very ambitious growth agenda. I want to talk about that later. I want to first talk about the global environment. Reciprocal tariff, country by country, bilateral discussions with Donald Trump and his team about how to get some relief. We're in a bit of a pause, but I'm not too sure how long the pause will last. What's your assessment of this whole trade war situation?
Well, let me start by putting the layout, the global context first. I think if you look at the issue of the trade balance, you are an economist, Timer. The trade balance is a reflection of the saving investment gap. Yeah, so the way I look at it, if this Trump administration would like to introduce the so-called the tax cut, this will widen the trade deficit. And if the way they address the trade deficit by increasing tariff, I don't think that this policy will entirely address this issue of this trade balance. What is happening in the US that you would expect, that's probably there is a risk of the inflationary, the slowdown of the economic growth. So under this kind of situation, it's not easy for the Fed to make a decision because the probability of recession probably will increase. At the same time, there is a risk of the inflationary, whether they have to cut the rate or they have to increase the rate. They are really at a crossroad now. Of course, this will have an implication to the global trade. Yeah, I can imagine that export in many emerging developing economies will be affected. But now let me talk about what will be the implication for Indonesia. The way I look at it, the share of export Indonesia to GDP is only 25%, right? And if you look at the share of export, Indonesia export to US is only 10%. So if you look at the direct impact, perhaps the direct impact to Indonesian GDP, it's probably about 2.5%. So the impact will be relatively limited. So I'm quite confident that this year the economic growth in Indonesia will be faster than Singapore. Why is that? Because in the case of Singapore, your export to GDP is about 120%, 180 actually. And if you look at even Vietnam, it's about almost 90%. So under this kind of situation, Indonesia will still maintain the relatively high growth in Southeast Asia. Of course, the Indonesian economy will be affected by, my estimate is probably about 0.5%. So if the baseline is about 5%, so probably we are experiencing the situation about 4.5% of the economic growth this year. It's not easy, but the good news is, I would call Indonesia is one of the least unattractive countries in the world. Not because we are doing great, but because the other part of the world are in trouble. So if you are an investor, you're talking about, you're not looking for perfection. You are looking for relative return. And Indonesia is still an interesting country to invest. Yeah, and then in addition to that, with the risk of the trade war between US and China, I won't be surprised if there is a sort of like relocation of the production base from China to Southeast Asian countries. Maybe to Vietnam, maybe to Indonesia. But the way I look at it, if you look at the trade surplus between Vietnam and the US, it's about 120 billion US dollar. Whereas for Indonesia, it's about 19 billion US dollar. So for us, it's relatively easy to settle this issue with the US. Whereas in the case of Vietnam, if they want to settle this issue of this trade surplus, they probably have to increase their import about 11 to 12 times. It's not easy. Yeah, so that is why I can see the possibilities of relocation from China into Indonesia, provided the government could implement the economic deregulation. The good news is President Prabowo already announced last April that government is committed to economic deregulation. I hope I respond to your question.
I want to stay with the global agenda a little longer. To your point that if the US has an inflation problem, while the rest of the world does not, if the US has a savings investment gap problem, which might be exacerbated if there is a tax cut, which looks likely, while the rest of the world really does not. In a situation like that, where do you see the dollar go, and then therefore what does it mean for rupiah? where do you see US interests go, and what does it mean for Indonesia's interest rates?
Very good question, because when, before the reciprocal tariff, I was expecting with the universal tariffs about 10% when President Trump came to power. I was expecting that dollar will continue to be the safe haven asset. Yeah, but seems to me that after the reciprocal tariff, there are some concern from the financial market about the role of dollar to be the only one safe haven asset. So if you look at, I'm not saying that this, will happen in the extreme case radically, but there is a tendency of the so-called the de-dollarization at this moment. And for that reason, we can see the depreciation of the US dollar against major currency, including the rupiah. Yeah, even though nowadays the rupiah is still about 16,400. So the way I look at it, Timer, under this kind of situation, I won't be surprised if in the medium term we will see the depreciation of the US dollar against major currency. So there is a room for Bank Indonesia to cut the rate. Yeah, and then I think this just
right now
today, right? The Bank Indonesia cut the 25 basis point. I can see more room, because if you look at our inflation, it's about less than 3% now, 2.5%. If the tendency of the US dollar is depreciate against major currency, so I think there is a room for Bank Indonesia to cut the rate. And if you look at the real return, yeah, the spread between, let's say, the Indonesian government bond and the inflation, and also the SRBI, for example, I think for many investors, investing in the rupiah is quite attractive. So I think there is a room for Bank Indonesia to cut the rate, unless the Fed, which is not an easy situation at this moment, raise the interest rate. Yeah, but with the probability of recession probably around 40% for the US, it's not easy for the Fed to raise the rate. At least probably what they will do, if they don't want to cut the rate, probably they will maintain the Fed fund rate at this level.
I think we're exactly on the same page on this. If you were to advise Bank Indonesia, since you and I both believe that the dollar might have more downside ahead, would you advise Bank Indonesia to reallocate some of their dollar reserve to a different currency?
Yes, I think it is very important. Now, if you look at, this is very interesting. This is the new development now. Well, probably not new development, because it's also happened during the Trump 1.0. If you look at what happened during the Trump 1.0, the gold price also soaring at the time, right? Similar to this kind of situation. Correct me if I'm wrong, the BIS has just proved that gold to be part of the high quality asset at this moment, right? So looking at this, maybe it is very important to sort of like do the diversification of the basket currency, yeah, for any central bank all over the world.
And for the client universe that's sitting here right now, would you also advise them to reduce their exposure to the US dollar?
Well, I have to say that if you expect that the renminbi will replace the US dollar, this will take probably about 10 to 15 years, because if you look at the share of the renminbi in the sovereign wealth fund, in the global transaction, it's still pretty small. Euro still a very important role, it's about 40%, and also US dollar. But under this kind of situation, I would say that the trend of the so-called the de-dollarization will happen, even though will not replace the role of the US as the reserve currency, at least for another 5 years.